on. Scott Bennett.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, Jim, as Orwell said, sometimes the duty of a responsible man is to restate the obvious. I was in Iran last year, and I say that just to remind the audience or introduce new people who haven't seen the show before. I was in Iran last year for the New Horizons Conference, along with Phil Giraldi and Mike Maloof and Peter Van Buren and J. Michael Springman and an assortment of others, Kevin Barrett, Jim Dean of Veterans Today, a whole host of former U.S. military and intelligence people and political people and journalists from around the world, people from Ireland, people from Australia. There was a Jewish rabbi, Orthodox, Dovid Weiss, I think his name was, and you talked about how Zionism, political Zionism, really is a offense to natural Jewish, Hebrew, Old Testament beliefs and lifestyle. A pastor preacher who was a boxer from Australia talked similar how Christian Zionism is a complete false heretical teaching in Christian theology. So when I was in Iran, I came into the presence of people that were very, very smart, very experienced, very skilled, very temperamentally balanced, and were interested in truth, interested in facts, interested in really diplomatic, ambassadorial, peacemaking, and prosperity developing relationships. And all of them came away and have always had the idea that Iran is not a threat to the United States at all. There's no hostility. There's no violence. They're not throwing homosexuals off rooftops. They're not being ruled by a kamikaze religious class of mullahs. It is not anything what Fox News propaganda and these people who are paid commentators to spew lies constantly abuse the American public with. Iran was a very peaceful, very humble, gentle people and culture. I never saw any instability, and I never felt any hostility. And it's amazing to me that the American public have been kept in the dark for so long. That being said, there are other people that are sharing this that are now writing to the president, similar to the voices that you've read, Jim, such as Senator Dick Black just wrote and sent a letter to the president. And I've had many conversations with Senator Dick Black and interviewed him. And I think a lot of our work has been seeping into the minds of people like Senator Black and others. And they're seeing that the reasonableness of our arguments and the dispassionate logic and presentation of heartfelt truth is leading them to the source of all truth, the God of all truth. So Senator Dick Black, in writing a letter to President Trump, reiterating all of the things that we believe, which is war with Iran is unnecessary, and worse, it's going to result in the destruction of the United States, essentially. It'll result in the destruction of the United States if it happened, because we lose all of the liberties, all of the goodwill around the world. It's totally unnecessary. The world has seen our 7 countries in 5 years since 9/11. They've seen Libya, they've seen Syria, they've seen Iraq, they've seen Afghanistan, all of which was worthless and pointless. Europe has suffered it. The European Union is breaking down because of the influx of these rapid migrant hordes that have flooded up into Europe. And I think if a war was triggered by Israel or Saudi Arabia, you would see a whole birth of negative consequences. I think everyone in the United States would come to hate and revile Jews and Israel like never before, because they would have seen them as the propagators of this conflict, as well as the mainstream media. And Trump is skating on very, very thin ice. The more he sides with these believers in that cause, these lunatics like John Bolton and these fools and lobotomized idiots like Pompeo, who are up there menacingly repeating these slogans that no longer work, that as if they're selling to us, these old beliefs that were cast out after Iraq, which is, weapons of mass destruction, Iran's a threat, blah, blah, blah. No one believes that. And the more dangerous thing, of course, is the consolidation of the allies of Iran, such as Russia and China and others, coming together saying, no, we're not going to allow it. And having one aircraft carrier or one American ship or something sunk sends us into a precipice, a domino effect that may be very similar to World War I. And Trump, I think, is trying not to fall into that, but everybody around him is pushing him in that direction. So this is the time that Trump needs to really heed the voices of people like Senator Dick Black. I'll be returning to Iran. So will all of the others who went to the conference in September. And we will be voicing the same peaceful prosperity and collaborative understanding that we can. But Trump really needs to set a new tone, set a new direction, set new people, get a new varsity team, and fire everybody that he's got on the field. Because he's got a bunch of cheerleaders on the football field right now, and he needs some real football players that know how to act as a team and score some touchdowns, and those touchdowns meaning the peace and stability of the world, not a bunch of lunatics throwing their heels up and exploding into cheers. Jim?
Yeah, thank you, Michael J.
Thank you. I'm looking at the fact that Scott has again pointed out that the foundation for this whole 7 nations in 5 years was the false flag of 9/11. And you've also made that very clear, Jim, that we're looking at something that can no longer be sustained or justified, and that is Mr. Trump, it's obvious, is being coerced. Mr. Trump is doing things that his campaign said he wasn't going to do. And there are people around him that are very, for some reason, very effective in manipulating him. When I found out that the plan was to cause the Venezuelan people to continue to suffer by setting things up and shutting down a program that has been feeding tens of thousands of Venezuelan people who are hungry and suffering and eating cat food and sometimes eating cats, the reality is this policy that is using sanctions against nations who have not aggressed against us but just want to hold on to their own natural resources. This policy is from the pit of hell, Mr. Trump. The American people don't support this. I can remember when there were other nations that went through some kind of terrible thing, from earthquakes or floods or fires or tornadoes or tsunamis, that we would send millions of dollars worth of food to those people. They didn't ask for it, and even if they did, the Americans were more than willing to give it. But what I'm saying is, using a policy like you're doing and causing starvation in Yemen, causing horrific privation in Syria, and bombing 3 of their oil tankers, this is something that is so disgusting to the American people. I'm encouraging anybody I can talk with, to say they need to talk to you and tell you that no matter what people are using to influence you towards this kind of evil, you're not representing America anymore if you don't stop. The people that are talking to you must hate America. They must despise the image of the land of the free and the home of the brave. The Lord rebuked those people, and you need to start listening to the people who really want you to succeed and do what's right. Jim.
Wow. So
Thank you, Michael J. Meanwhile, Moscow has broken its silence on the claim that Russia is not willing to sell S-400s to Iran. Apparently, that was propaganda. And the decision has not been made, but Russia has sold them to Syria. I expect they will sell them to Iran. U.S. figures of casualties in Iraq and Syria has hidden the true devastating scale of civilian deaths. This is rather unsurprising, but fascinating. The U.S.-led coalition that launched airstrikes against Iraq and Syria against ISIS admitted Friday the attacks had killed civilians, but the number they reported, 1,302 in a 5-year period, was immediately dismissed as too low by the human rights organization Amnesty International. It's got to be off by a factor 10, 20, maybe even 100, I have no doubt. While all admissions of responsibility by U.S.-led coalition for civilian casualties are welcome, the coalition remains deeply in denial about the devastating scale of the civilian casualties. The coalition, in a statement announcing the findings, said that of the 34,502 strikes, 34,502, which according to them killed less than one person per strike, not even one. I mean, this is as absurd as it gets.
Right.
Between August 2014 and the end of April 2019, found at least 1,302 civilians had been killed. Yeah, Well, the number is overwhelmingly greater. Every case in which a coalition has admitted responsibility has only happened after civilian deaths were investigated and brought to the attention of organizations like Amnesty International and Air Wars. In April, Amnesty and Air Wars projected 1,600 had died in coalition airstrikes in the city of Raqqa alone from June to October of 2017, a number that in 4 months is higher than the coalition's total funding for over 4 years. Can you imagine conducting all those airstrikes and not even killing one person? I mean, this is absurd. Meanwhile, Dianne Feinstein's been busted for talking to Iran on an unsecure iPhone. Dianne Feinstein, the filthy gun grabber who hates the Constitution, was caught violating the Logan Act by talking to Iran without permission from Trump. Jake Sherman saw her iPhone. She'd been talking to the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif. Bear in mind, Trump has been telling Iran he wants to talk to them right away, but nobody can get a phone call with Iran arranged. All that deep state scum like Feinstein are probably telling Iran not to talk to Trump. We're going to get rid of him as fast as we can. This is a big deal. Dianne Feinstein had Javad Zarif on speed dial. Who knows what type of evil she's been plotting behind Trump's back. Nobody but the State Department is allowed to talk to Iran without the permission of Trump. Maybe she's trying to hire him as her new driver since her last one was outed as a Chinese spy. And of course, nothing happened to Dianne about that. Our country is a total joke. Trump should put this filth in prison as well as anybody else who's talking to Iran when he can't even get a phone call. It's legal for Feinstein to do this. It's illegal for Feinstein to do this, as it's a violation of the Logan Act, just as John Kerry is guilty of Logan Act violations. But of course, no one will do anything about it, because we live in a fake country with a fake justice system where nobody at the top gets in trouble. Meanwhile, Moscow is ready to facilitate non-aggression pacts between Iran and the other Gulf states. Russia's influence in the region is growing by leaps and bounds. Lavrov stated Moscow would welcome the start of meaningful dialogue between Iran and the U.S., but would not impose its role as a mediator. The minister criticized U.S. pressure against Iran, saying the hardline push for more sanctions leaves no room for negotiations, and Russia will not support this. Talking from a position of, first I'll strangle you economically and then you'll be begging to reach a deal with us, is not something we consider an appropriate model of foreign policy. How appropriate is that? Meanwhile, the U.S. deployed an aircraft carrier strike group and announced plans to send extra troops to Iraq. Officials in Tehran responded, saying they're prepared to target U.S. warships in the event of a provocation. Iran has denounced the sanctions and vowed to retaliate against any form of aggression. We hope we can start a dialogue, but we are ready for war, a senior Iranian diplomat told reporters earlier this week. Scott.
Yeah, Iran, I think, has been proven to be a major miscalculation of the Trump foreign policy calculus in 2018 when he removed the JCPOA and pulled the United States out, and then moved the Jerusalem U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and then now giving the Syrian Golan Heights to Israel. All of these have been very bad optics to the Iranian and many of the other Muslim countries, and it's a complete waste. I understand Trump may feel he has to pay back the Sheldon Adelson and Roger Ailes or whoever these other wealthy Jewish Zionist bankrollers of his campaign may have done. But this is not about paying back the political favors of people that bankrolled your campaign. This is about world peace. This is about world stability. This is about the United States of America. And for all of these actions Trump took in the beginning, it's very difficult to walk backwards out of that. It's very difficult to win back the trust of the Iranians, not because you've never really had it, because you haven't since 1953, but you've antagonized and made the situation worse. There are some good points on the horizon. I like to see Lavrov following our advice, Jim. You recall we've been saying this for quite some time, that the Russians need to position themselves as the mediator, as the interlocutor, as the liaison between the United States and Iran. Russia has a very powerful diplomatic voice and is both liked and feared by Iran. and the United States is also likes and fears Russia. So there's a very tenuous balance between the three countries that can be very productive for diplomatic conversations about what are the basic essentials of live and let live. And it has to revolve around a certain security of Israel. That's seeming to be part of a major foreign policy red line. But at the same time, there needs to be ceasing of settlements and expansion and things like that. And Russia's in a good position to bring all of these forth. And I think the other thing about Feinstein, remember there is a deep state in Iran. Zarif, the foreign minister, did not want us going over to Iran last year. He denied us our visas. It was only the religious leader of Iran that overrode Zarif and granted us our visas. So when Zarif is talking to Feinstein, that seems to be the deep state talking to the deep state. Feinstein's a traitor. She should be hung by the neck for all of the treason that she did. She got a letter from Senator Bill Nelson about me regarding the Swiss banks and the Shell Game report and Snowden. So Feinstein will be prosecuted and hanged for that. But seeing her talk to Zarif, the person who was responsible for trying to shut down the New Horizons Conference, Zarif did not want the New Horizons Conference and all of the dialogue between the Americans coming over to Iran. He did not want that. So Zarif needs to go, and I've said that for some time now. He quit for a second and then came back in, but I was very disappointed to see that, because I think Iran needs an entire new team doing diplomatic overtures, and they need to basically establish a relationship with the United States before any topics of discussion can even be developed. So we're sort of right back to zero, which is okay. But in order for Trump, again, to win the election, he needs to show very solid, stable advancement in foreign policy towards Iran and North Korea, or else Tulsi Gabbard can come in and win the whole ball game and simply say, "Hey, elect me. I'm gonna pardon the whistleblowers, and I'm going to make peace with Iran and North Korea and let live." I'm going to make it a national policy. We are not going in to do any more regime change anywhere. And I think the majority of Americans would vote for her on that. They voted for Trump because he alluded to doing that, and then he has hypocritically allowed himself to be moved in the opposite direction. And so he needs to gain control of his foreign policy, and really utilize other countries to take the burden off of his own shoulders and get rid of it, because otherwise it becomes a pride issue. He needs to work as a team with other countries to establish relations, work with Oman, work with Switzerland, work with Russia to develop new inroads to Iran, and you may see a total turn in the positive direction. Jim?
Michael J.
Trump's position reminds me of situations that happened in places where you have literal minefields, where you might discover that you and your group are actually in the middle of a minefield, and starting from the rear, you have to have people back up, looking back to where their footsteps were before, and literally back up into your own footsteps. And this is what Mr. Trump needs to do. And part of that backing up, as Scott has pointed out, is getting rid of people like Pompeo and Bolton.
Yeah.
The reality is that we saw this coming when we saw Nikki Haley spouting her Zionist garbage and her filthy hatred for the truth and her love of lying. This was odious and disgusting to people who want a real government, not a government that's willing to do brinksmanship where people are dying because they're promoting war propaganda and promoting things that turn out to be false flags like yellow cake and weapons of mass destruction. There are generations now, Mr. Trump, that have been fighting in false flag wars since the 60s, and they're watching you. And many of them came out. They hadn't gone to the polls in a long time, but millions of people came out because they were longing for you to be an answer to prayer. And when you started telling the truth to the American people, we heard you. Don't let the fools around you back you into a corner that you can't get out of. Because any war with Iran is going to mean not thousands, but tens of thousands of deaths at least. And it could be avoided because you'll never be able to justify anything when the truth comes out and you're still alive and people want you to be executed as much as they wanted Hillary Clinton to be executed. So you've got a choice to make, and that is listen to the American people. Now, Russia understands, and Russia is going to back up Iran. But why? Why are things going bad? You've still got sanctions against Korea. You've still got sanctions against Venezuela, against Syria, against Iran, and against Russia. Do you see a pattern, Mr. Trump? Leave these people alone. You don't need to force them to do what's right. You should be leading by example. Or is that too novel for you? Go right ahead, Jim.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's something else.
U.S. forces blow up 3 oil tankers in Syria, enforcing an oil embargo. This is embarrassing, in my opinion. U.S.-led forces have blown up 3 oil tankers in Syria as the U.S. increases pressure on Syria by thwarting oil trade between the PKK-YPG and the Assad regime, according to local sources. The strike was carried out by coalition planes, which hit 3 oil tankers, using 4 dead. The coalition has not yet made a statement about the attack. In the area controlled by Assad, oil consumption stands at around 136,000 barrels per day. Production, however, is only 24,000 barrels per day, meaning the regime must import.
Wait, Jim, your voice, you're mute.
You're kidding.
You lost your voice.
You can't hear me?
Now we can. Now we can. Go ahead. Back up a little bit.
That's very strange, Don.
Yeah, I know.
U.S. forces have blown up 3 oil tankers in Syria, enforcing an oil embargo. The strike was carried out by coalition planes, which hit 3 oil tankers, leaving 4 dead. The coalition hasn't yet made a statement about the attack, but in the area controlled by Assad, oil consumption stands at around 136,000 barrels per day. Production only 24,000 barrels per day, leaving them like 112,000 barrels per day short, meaning the regime must import significant volumes of crude oil at an estimated expense of more than $2 billion per year. The attack came a couple of weeks after the EU extended its sanctions on the Assad regime for 1 year after the Syrian regime upped the ante.
I hear you, Jim.
Yeah?
I can't hear you. You're being cut off either strategically outside or something's going on with your
Yeah. They cut off my phone call. The judge tried to call me. I couldn't even get the phone call. It wasn't even on my cell phone. They're doing massive interference with me. Do we want to back up and start this segment again?
No. I think this is
Okay. All right. The U.S. has confirmed its updated maps to show disputed Golan Heights as Israeli. This is outrageous. After Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu showed off a map of Israel he received from the White House signed by Donald Trump, the State Department has confirmed it's officially changed its maps to show the disputed Golan Heights as Israeli territory. Very bad. Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner gifted him the map while touring the region ahead of the U.S.-sponsored Economic Peace Summit set to be held in Bahrain in late June, during which Trump's so-called deal of the century will be unveiled. Well, he's already given away Jerusalem. He's already given away the Golan Heights. He's already unfunded the UN Commission for Refugees in the Middle East. He's already designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guards to be a terrorist group. What is there left to negotiate? In my opinion, it looks to me like Trump's deal of the century will be to load all the Palestinians aboard a ship, float it out to sea, and sink it. This is embarrassingly bad. The White House has bestowed U.S. formal recognition on the disputed Syrian-claimed Golan Heights since late March, when Trump issued a bombshell announcing it's time for the U.S. to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty. The rest of the world recognizes, however, that it's Syrian-occupied territory. Meanwhile, it turns out, surprise, surprise, NASA found Israel intel for targeted assassinations
you know,
Back, Jim.
What happened, Jim?
I'm telling you, this guy is an internet genius. Okay, this guy who's suing me, and this is clearly his work. There's just no other explanation for it. So
Okay.
there was supposed to be this conversation, you know, at 1:30, and I was supposed to be called on my phone. And the court claimed they called me 3 times. My phone didn't ring once. The judge said he left me a personal message. It's not on my phone. This is very clever. They're growing desperate.
Jim,
Oh,
let's always introduce this to the court, though. You can say that Posner has been working with internet targeting organizations, and you know Scott Bennett's YouTube that is on a CNN report when they say, let's go after this guy, Army PSYOP. So you can introduce to the court that you are being meddled and interfered with by associates of the Posner internet attack team. Go ahead.
God, I want
right
you
here.
as a witness in my case, by the way. I want you
Yeah,
to be there. This is very significant.
Right.
Meanwhile, NSA relationship with Israeli Signet National Unit has been revealed. This is very, very disturbing. Using the familiar rationale of terrorists to excuse cooperation they knew was illegal, the NSA and ISNU found a workaround using the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, providing the Israelis with all the intel they needed, according to an October 2006 article in NSA's internal publication. To ISNU, that's the Israeli, this prohibition on sharing data for targeted killings was contrary not only to supporting Israel in its fight against Hezbollah, but overall to support the U.S. global war on terrorism. Its author, his name is redacted, details the late-night, sometimes tense discussions he had with ISNU officials who believed they deserved an exemption from the U.S. prohibition on abetting targeted killings. The documents don't detail what arrangement was eventually worked out, but the Israeli military used the American data to lay waste to Lebanon's civilian population, much like the tech-enhanced U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, whose kill count swelled with civilian victims after they received access to NSA targeting data. This is absolutely disgusting. The strategy had a name. The Deya doctrine, and Israeli officials admitted it was deliberate, but despite its brutality, they were unable to win the war. A leaked presentation about the NSA-ISNU relationship notes public confidence in IDF erodes. IDF image damaged after the seemingly outmatched Hezbollah fighters were able to keep the Israelis at bay. Nevertheless, the IDF was, according to the presentation, gearing up for round 2. Apparently unsatisfied with a legal loophole the Americans have created for them, the Israelis sought and received full access to the NSA's massive surveillance data troves after the war. A 2009 Memorandum of Understanding officially gave ISNU unrestricted access to NSA's raw intelligence data, including the phone and internet records of American citizens and citizens of third-party countries. Only American officials' data was excluded on an honor system basis. Almost no strings were attached to this bonanza. The Israelis could even release the identities of Americans whose information had been scooped up in the dragnet, as long as they asked the NSA for permission first, and could pass the data on to anyone at all if the names were redacted. Scott.
Wow.
Well, we've learned that's all a lie, isn't it? Because an American citizen can be targeted and profiled and recorded, and it is done, as John Brennan said, through reverse targeting, where they pretend they're going after someone named Ahmad Jehoshaphat, and in fact, they're targeting Jim Fetzer or Michael J. or Scott Bennett or Don Grahn or someone else. There is nobody named Ahmad Jehoshaphat. They're going after the American citizen in order to provide that intel to the British or the Australians or the Israelis for all sorts of nefarious purposes. And then they will in turn provide it to the FBI, saying, we've got this from a foreign intelligence source. And now the FBI can open up a domestic investigation and then go through your tax records and video games that you've played or internet sites you visited, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a shell game. This is a musical chairs game. This is intelligence laundering. Remember the term money laundering? This is intelligence laundering. And this is what Snowden warned of. This is what Julian Assange revealed in the WikiLeaks cables and all of these things, the documentation. We're seeing layer upon layer of a national security, national police state, intelligence, totalitarian Orwellian state that was started under the impulses of 2001 and Dick Cheney and Bush and all the other people, and it's coming to full fruition. The fact that Snowden revealed this in 2000 or this was a 2007, 2008 revelation for the earlier war, these things are still occurring. Tulsi Gabbard once again has went on, and she's been one of the few voices that has said, I'm alarmed and disturbed by this. She doesn't support this, and Trump didn't support this either. That's why people elected him. Again, what's most odious, Jim, it seems to be, and again, I'm intuitively putting myself in the interpretive position of the American public, and I see them and I feel them and I sense them beginning to define Trump as a bunch of empty calories. He's an empty calorie candy bar. There's no nourishment. There's no vitamins. There's nothing healthy. Anybody can go down to Mexico, bring a wall, and electrocute or shoot or remove every Mexican and Latin American that tries to sneak across. Everybody loves that. Everybody supports that. And nobody wants that except the leftist lunatics. So the domestic policy wall is an easy victory for Trump. However, it is overshadowed and all the good is lost by these foreign policy adventures, not because of the fiascoism of it or the failing of it, but because of the hypocrisy of it. That's what offends Americans. That's what makes it stink, is they look and they feel, that old saying, shame, fool me once, shame on me, or shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. People are feeling shamed because they feel fooled twice. They feel Trump is doing the hypocrisy and he's lied and he's doing the opposite of what he said he was going to do. And Syria is a prime case. He said, why are we in Syria? What are we doing there? This is an entire waste. He said 9/11 was blown up. He said his builders said there were bombs inside. It wasn't just planes, and that even is subject to interpretation. So Trump has admitted 9/11 was blown up inside. He's admitted that Syria was failed. He's admitted that Iraq was a major failing of the war. We should never have been into Iraq. And yet he's got John Bolton as his quarterback. And John Bolton is the architect of much of this 9/11 idiocy. He's got State Department Pompeo, who he talked to Bill Binney, and Bill Binney talked to Pompeo and explained to him that the Russians could not have done this. This was an inside job. And yet Pompeo is regurgitating the lies. So it's like they are going out of their way to ignore the truth and go down this path of hypocrisy and contradiction that is, I think, growing increasingly revealed to Americans and offensive to Americans. And at some point, they're going to feel very betrayed and angry and pick up their ball and bat and leave the field and not turn up to vote or vote for Tulsi Gabbard. And that's a great risk, because if Trump is removed and Democrats get in, well, then you've got a civil war, because then you've got the end of the Republic, you've got the end of the Second Amendment, you've got all sorts of chaos that'll be unfolded, you've got the flooding of the borders, and perhaps that is God turning this country over to the sins of its past to decimate it in the future. I don't know, but if Trump doesn't turn back to the populist spirit, he very well could be recognized as the worst president in history. I hope that's not true. Jim?
Michael J.
Yes, what Scott is saying is that if Trump actually fails, and he could, if he continues in his present course, he could actually lose everything. In some ways, the nation would be worse off, because the height that he would be dropping from in giving Americans hope would be a horrific fall. Now, I don't believe that Tulsi Gabbard should ever be president for a number of reasons, but the issue for us is that she's actually saying the things that are agreeing with a moral position. And the fact is that because Trump is listening to people who are promoting Israel first, not America first. None of these things are helping Americans, Mr. Trump. stealing all that land from Syria and stealing their oil and cutting off their ability to feed their own people and have their own government is still regime change, Mr. Trump. You have been deceived, or you're being manipulated or blackmailed. Who can tell? Because we certainly aren't hearing any justification, any real justification. We could believe you when you said, we've been getting bad deals with China, because you justified it. But you're not justifying any of this garbage with respect to continuing to facilitate the 7 nations in 5 years plan and promoting Israel and putting down the sovereign boundaries of another country that we're not even at war with. Wow. Syria didn't attack us. You attacked it, and you're continuing to attack it, following the actual plans of Obama, the enemy of America, and Hillary Clinton. They started this, and you're continuing it. And who are you listening to? You're not listening to honest people. You're not listening to people who don't want you to turn America into a bunch of pirates. Are you listening to the Skull and Bones cult? What are we supposed to think? Because what you're doing is not lawful. It is disgusting, and is favoritism to a bunch of sociopathic, organ harvesting, child trafficking monsters who promote the assassination programs in America using the data they're getting from the NSA. Scott Bennett went and learned about Deep Black, where the CIA and the Mossad were operating, bringing in the drugs into America, and you know that people are dying by the tens of thousands because they're still doing it.
Wow.
You need to stop doing what you're doing, Mr. Trump.
Wow. Yeah, I get it.
Meanwhile, crop fires, a weapon of war, ruin Iraqi and Syrian harvests. This is devastating. It was looking to be a good year for farmers across parts of Syria and Iraq. The wettest in generations. It brought rich golden fields of wheat and barley, giving farmers in this war-torn region reason to rejoice. But good news is short-lived in this part of the country, where residents of the two countries struggle to cope with seemingly never-ending violence and turmoil amid Syria's civil war and attacks by remnants of the Islamic State. Now, even in areas where conflict has subsided, fires have been raging in farmers' fields, depriving them of valuable crops. The blazes have been blamed on defeated ISIS militants seeking to avenge their losses, or on Syrian government forces battling to rout other armed groups, but I find that highly improbable. Thousands of acres of wheat and barley in both Syria and Iraq have been scorched by the fires during the harvest season. The life that we live is already bitter, said Hussein Atiyah, a farmer from a region in northern Iraq. If the situation continues like this, I would say that no one will stay here. I plant 500 to 600 acres every year. Next year, I wouldn't be able to do that because I cannot stay here and guard the land day and night. ISIS militants have a history of implementing a scorched earth policy in areas from which they retreat or where they are defeated. It's a means of inflicting a collective punishment on those left behind, said Emma Beale, an independent Syrian researcher. ISIS militants claim responsibility for burning crops in their weekly newsletter, saying they targeted farms belonging to senior officials in 6 Iraqi provinces and in Kurdish-administered eastern Syria, highlighting the persistent threat from the group even after its territorial defeat. It seemed there will be a hot summer that will burn the pockets of the apostates as well as their hearts as they burn the Muslims in their homes for the past year, said an ISIS publication. Hundreds of acres of wheat fields around Kirkuk in northern Iraq were set on fire. Several wheat fields in the Dakuk district in southern Kirkuk burned for 3 days straight. Farmers have tried to put out the fires, but they're raging. It's outrageous. It's tragic. Meanwhile, the Secretary of Defense acting is split with Trump over North Korean missile tests. He's saying they're a violation. Trump is downplaying it. A UN resolution bars North Korea from testing any ballistic missiles, regardless of range, as Bolton pointed out to reporters on Saturday. But Trump took a different line over the weekend during his visit to Japan. North Korea fired off some small weapons which disturbed some of my people and others, but not me. He tweeted the same day as Bolton's comments. There have been no ballistic missiles going out, Trump told reporters before backtracking, no long-range missiles going out. Scott.
Well, the other thing Trump said in that response to North Korea was that he is not in a rush. He is patient, and that was a very good thing to say. His admission that, look, North Korea and every other country, Iran included, has a duty and a responsibility to its people to defend against invasion. The United States, under the Constitution, guarantees to every American under Article 3, Section 4 of the Constitution, the right to be protected from invasion. And right now, Gavin Newsom is violating that constitutional law by invading the United States with sanctuary cities. So there's a reason for the insurrection and the arrest of Gavin Newsom that should come. And the declaration of the California state is a state of rebellion, and New California needs to arise, and it is. And in other states as well, people separating from this fascist, liberal, leftist impulse, which is decimating cities like Los Angeles and Seattle. But North Korea and Iran, they all have a duty to protect their populations, and missiles, as well as their airplanes and submarines and anything else, are a weapon system for that. And the United Nations didn't come to the rescue of Iraq or Libya or Syria. So really, the United Nations Security Council, I wouldn't listen to them at all if I was any of these countries, because they're worthless. They don't do anything. And that's the whole reason that North Korea said, we are not going to denuclearize. We're not going to leave ourselves open to being bayoneted like Gaddafi was. And I think Trump is realizing that they're not going to bow down. I know his negotiating style and I know his art of the deal, but it does not apply in politics. It applies in business and skyscrapers and buildings. It does not apply to foreign cultures, foreign sensitivities, foreign myths, the entire different language of identity of foreign people does not absorb the art of the deal negotiating tactics of Trump's New York style of development. And that's been his major failure and his loss in the learning curve of being a diplomat, being a president, being a commander-in-chief of the military. You cannot engage these other nations from a superior position, or else they will shut down the window and turn off the radio and hunker down under siege. And that's what they're doing. And the difficulty is, if every nation is under siege, guess what? They're digging and developing black market tunnels to go around you, to go around the dollar, to go around everything that the American culture represents. So I think as much as Trump is wise to say he's patient and he's open for a deal, he also, again, needs to get rid of this beta team of beta males like Shanahan and Pompeo and Bolton. They're a bunch of beta males, half-wit, jealous, ugly weaklings. He needs a handsome Cary Grant alpha male varsity team coming on, like Dick Black and others, to say, okay, the real Americans are on the field, and we're all going to get along, and we're going to lead by example, and we're going to be John Wayne, move with a softness in our voice and a strength in our arm that we do not have to use because everybody recognizes us for it. Jim?
Michael J.
Thank you. Scott, I hope that Mr. Trump will do a thorough background check and find out whether or not these alpha males, as so-called, that he actually needs, have the right sexual proclivities, okay, because he can't tell anymore. The issue is what we're seeing in these scorched earth policies of these people that were trained by the CIA and trained by Mossad to destroy other nations. This is a terrible thing, but like you said, Scott, we're going to probably see Iran start helping Syria and Iraq. We're going to see Russia start helping Syria and Iraq. We're going to see these people actually consolidating and with the kind of agreements that I believe Jim is going to talk about shortly. We're going to see these people hunker down and start collectively doing their trade, within nations that are also being sanctioned. And I approve that North Korea understood, and they saw what they did to Gaddafi and other people who gave up their weapons and then were treated like dogs and raped with a bayonet. So I think that this is a terrible time for Americans to continue to pretend that Mr. Trump has got his house in order, because there are people around him that are lying through their teeth because they are whores for the state of Israel and the globalists like the Vatican, the Vatican actually uses the Rothschild Zionists as their bankers. So this is an incestuous relationship. These are the demonic Siamese twins from hell. That is Luciferian Vatican worship, and the Zionists who also hate the God of heaven and earth. Jim?
Thank you. Meanwhile, Nevada's Democratic governor vetoes a bill to abolish the Electoral College. Good for him. Our founding fathers created a federal republic wherein the national government shares political power with state governments instead of a centralized political system like China or the UK, where political power is in the central government and whatever powers are exercised by regional or local have been delegated to them and thus can also be taken away by the national government. To enable and uphold the American Federation, the founders created the U.S. Senate, in which each constituent state is represented by 2 senators, no matter the size of its population. The Electoral College is another institution to prevent presidential elections from being determined by states with very large populations. Cognizant that human passions can descend into mob-like behaviors, the founders had another reason for the Electoral College: to prevent a tyranny of the irrational majority. The founders' fear of majority mob rule was borne out less than 3 years after they created the Electoral College in 1787, when the French Revolution plunged the country into a decade of chaos and bloodbath. Tyranny of the majority. Majority rule is an instrument of working democracies. Justice is based on what is sanctioned by the majority. However, majorities can be wrong. You cannot have majority rule without individual rights and make it work. Otherwise, it descends to mob rule, lynching, and the like. Still in denial that Hillary lost the 2016 presidential election, convinced she'd secured a majority of the popular vote, which Dennis Charnin, a brilliant statistician, has demonstrated to be false, Democrats are mobilizing to abolish the Electoral College via the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. To date, 14 states and the District of Columbia passed legislation to give their 189 Electoral College votes to whichever presidential candidate wins the popular vote. The pact will only take effect if states holding the majority of the Electoral College's 538 electoral votes join the agreement. On May 29th, by a 12-8 vote, the Nevada State Senate passed a bill to give the state 6 Electoral College votes to the winner of the presidential election's national popular vote. Earlier, Nevada State Assembly had passed a bill. The addition of Nevada would boost the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact electoral votes to 195. Happily, Nevada's governor, Steve Sisolak, who's threatened with a recall petition, surprised his critics by doing the right thing. As reported by The Hill, Governor Sisolak vetoed Assembly Bill 186 that would have pledged Nevada's Electoral College votes to the presidential candidate who wins the popular. He said in his statement, after thoughtful deliberation, I've decided to veto Assembly Bill 186. Once effective, our National Popular Vote Interstate Compact would diminish the role of smaller states like Nevada in national electoral contests and force Nevada's electors to side with whoever wins the national popular vote rather than the candidate Nevadans chose. I recognize that many of my fellow Nevadans may disagree on this point, and I appreciate the legislature's thoughtful consideration of this important issue. But notice, if that were the case, then all campaigning would be restricted to 5 or 6 large states. It would be New York, California, Florida, Texas. To hell with the rest, because they wouldn't count, they wouldn't make a difference. It's totally undemocratic and un-American. This is a Democratic Party betraying its own name to promote a kind of mob rule by those who have lost their way. Scott.
Amen.
Well, in the interest of time, Jim, I want you to give a thorough explanation of the Posner lawsuit, so I'm going to limit my comments with simply, we know that mob rule and the Democrat mentality and the scum and beta males and hermaphroditic transvestites and this whole poisonous group of idiots masquerading and actually championing the Democrat flag and the rainbow flag and all of that, they're pushing mob rule. They're pushing this anti-republic voting scheme because the world and the country has more idiots than normal, good-thinking people, and that's of course their agenda is very communist-based, where the elite, the illuminated, the Harvard-educated are at the top, and the rest are ruled under a police state. Jim?
Michael J.
I saw a horrific example of skirting the edge of the abyss, and that is during the time that Hawaii was experiencing all those amazing catastrophes from that volcano. A young girl was actually near the edge of the volcano, and there was a small earthquake and shook her right off into the volcano, and she was gone. And that was a horrific tragedy, but it was illustrative of a nation that has numbers of people walking around the abyss without really realizing how much danger they're in, and that this law represents America descending into mob rule chaos, as you said, Jim. And yes, please give us your report on the Posner case that you're going through. And thanks for today.
Thanks, Michael J. Well, here you see what we've seen of Lenny Posner in the past, a figure in the shadows. He's repeatedly remained in the shadows. Turns out we have a video where he was caught going into a court case. This turns out to be the actual guy who appeared in court. So he appears to have had a facelift to make himself look younger so that he'd be more likely to be taken to be the father of a 6-year-old who died in 2012. You'll notice him here. There he is in the shirt there without a coat. That's Lenny Posner right there, the shirt without a coat.
Real name's Leonard. How can we use the Eliza to purchase a firearm? Have anything to say to Wolfgang Halbig?
Here's a reporter asking questions Lenny wouldn't answer. Well, surprisingly, we had him for 7 hours of deposition. A representative for Wrongs Without Remedies, the publisher, took the first 5. I had the next hour and a half, and then he finished with the last half hour. I recently returned from the College of Complexes in Chicago, where I gave a talk on the 25th about the Sandy Hook Posner versus Fetzer lawsuit and why it matters. This was the single most enjoyable talk I ever gave, and I've given a whole lot, because they had a real rowdy freedom of speech crowd there. And after I spoke for an hour, I fielded questions and answers for 10 minutes. Then each of those who wanted had a 4-minute opportunity to attack me, to rebut me, and 7 or 8 took that opportunity. It was fascinating. I had the opportunity for a response. You can find it online, the Sandy Hook Posner versus Fetzer lawsuit, where I was described as a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, a fake news and false flag specialist, which is just fine. That's very close to who I am today. We're about to submit our response to each other's motions for summary judgment. This is, in my opinion, the decisive element of the case. During the delay we had in the start of the show today, I was on with a judge and the opposing attorney and gained 2 more days before the submission of my response, with a 1-day delay in our replies, but where the oral argument remains on track. The judge is moving this at breakneck speed. Other lawyers have said they've never seen a case move this fast. If the case is decided on the basis of evidence, if I can demonstrate that the death certificate, which I described as a fabrication, is indeed a fabrication, I ought to prevail, and I can do that. We'll see what happens now. Meanwhile, if you want to support this effort, this case is all about freedom of speech. It's not about defamation. They're trying to suppress Moonrock Books and keep me, Mike Palachek, Penn Magazine, others from talking about Sandy Hook. Go to moonrockbooks.com. That donate button is where you can contribute to the lawsuit, to the effort. It's getting very serious. I'm hopeful we'll have a resolution based on the motion. If not, we will be going to trial. Scott.
Jim, I really hope you go to trial, because will be one of the greatest trials since the Nuremberg trial, and I can't wait to be on there. But I wish, and I want to hear, when you interview this Posner guy, when you ask him questions, the Johnny Cochran OJ trial comes to mind, and how they ask questions is very significant, because you can ask this Posner guy, isn't it true, Mr. Posner, that this video right here of the guy who's pretending to be a SWAT officer holding his gun upside down is actually the father or one of the people that was in a later PBS broadcast? Isn't that true? This is the same guy in this picture. Isn't that true that he was a paid operative, that this whole thing was fake? Isn't it true that this picture here was done twice with little kids in a train? Isn't it true that
believe it or not, that would be ruled irrelevant, because the judge has restricted the focus to the death certificate and whether or not it is authentic. He doesn't even care how the boy died. He's essentially ruled out all the massive evidence I have about Sandy Hook. This is a very cleverly constructed lawsuit. They took years to plan this so they could try to filter out the massive evidence we have that proves Sandy Hook was a FEMA exercise, a mass casualty event involving children. I'm doing my best to work around it, and I believe you'll make a valuable witness, because you can address the motivation for why they would have to fake death certificates in this case, Scott. Meanwhile, Michael J.
Look, I wonder if we are going to get to the place where we actually expose Lenny Posner as using a pseudonym, and that he is not really Lenny Posner. And the reality of, this birth certificate, this is something that they've been doing even with Obama, but there's plenty of evidence that this is phony and that there was more than one birth certificate. And I'm amazed that this has gone this far, because the evidence continues to come out about even the fact that they purchased the coffins weeks before the event, and people are bearing witness that the coffins were buried filled with rocks. So, I mean, this is something that's going to come out, and the American people, I believe, deserve the truth here, because they're using this to actually commit an offense against our unalienable rights. And this is a trial that concerns all Americans, not just.
Thank you, Michael J. Don, your final thoughts, my friend.
Oh, yes, I understand that there was a fireman, the first fireman to show up at the Sandy Hook school, went in there and didn't find anybody. There's nobody. And the lights might even been off. Anyway, we're turning the lights on of truth here, folks. And this is one heck of a show here on June 4th. This is Truth versus News. I'm Donald Ryan, your producer. This show will be definitely on Facebook and other places and all over the world. We want you to share these truths, because that's what's really happening, folks. And I really thank you, gentlemen, for sharing the light of truth here. And hopefully I'll salute here on this historic week with D-Day and Liberty attack and things. So I thank you. So I guess we're going to sign off. I wish you the very best here. So
thank you,
God bless. Oh, God. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, gentlemen.